So, Seth, here's a strange thing. I feel like frequently you bring up names of people, like famous type Christian people, and ask me my opinion on them often. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Is it also fair to say that I never have any idea who they are?
Yeah.
I I think there's this kind of weird thing going on in kind of like the Christian world of where we've got like lots of celebrity pastors, celebrity Christians, this sorts of thing, and they get famous either on purpose or on accident through lots of different things. But as you ask me questions about like, what's your motivation to always be asking what I think about these different kind of celebrity type Christians?
That's a good question. So I grew up in the church.
Hmm.
I left the church and then came back to the church. Weird,
Ooh.
weird, weird turn of events. And I have always made it a point to not involve myself in the culture of the church. I don't enjoy it. I'll be blatantly honest about that. I
Uh-huh.
don't like it. So to me, I see these pastors who are, maybe getting famous on TikTok.
Sure.
To me, that's not what you should be doing.
Okay.
Like if I was gonna build, this is gonna sound weird. If I was to build the perfect Christian,
Uh-huh.
the perfect pastor Christian, would be someone who literally gives up everything to give back to the less fortunate.
Yeah.
That would be like, we don't have mansions and private jets.
Sure.
We've given up everything to live as modestly and minimally as possible to make sure others are reaping the benefits from what we're being given. Does that make sense?
I'd say there was a guy that gave up heaven and earth to come do that. So I think you're on the
Exactly.
right track.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So taking what Jesus did
Uh-huh.
and just emulating that.
Yeah.
So I see these big TikTok pastors, and I'm not going to say any of them in name because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Not that I would normally care, but I see them as the complete opposite.
Mm-hmm.
So when I ask you about certain people, it's because it's people that I see that are doing things that emulate what Jesus did. And so removing myself intentionally from the culture, I'm not familiar with them, with their ideology, with how they're known
Sure.
in the church world. So I ask these questions because I'm curious on, does this person have a solid theology? Are they actually doing what I would say a Christian should be doing? Or is their theology flawed and they're doing these things for themselves to reap the benefits? Because I feel like it's pretty easy to make yourself look humble and live minimally, but not, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
So that's my intention for asking these questions about these people,
Yeah.
because I don't necessarily know what things to look for that would say, that's not the person you should be
Yeah.
looking towards as an example.
Yeah. So I feel like we have these conversations. I don't want to make it sound like it's an everyday sort of thing, but fairly regularly. You and me and a couple of other people, Josh sometimes jumps in on them as well. And I think they're really helpful kind of for everybody that's there, just to be able to kind of look at some people and say, maybe is this the kind of lifestyle? Is this a Christ follower who we ought to be emulating? And I think one of the distinctions that we always try to make, right, is that well, like we're not the judge of people, right? And so we can kind of look at it and say, from a 2-minute TikTok video, right? Like we can find things to emulate or to not do, but like we're not saying these people are good or bad Christians, or that they are or aren't Christians. But I wonder if we could even have kind of like one of those conversations here, but just abandon a name? Talk about it in a more, I don't know, abstract way. Would that be a thing that we could try?
Sure.
All right, so we'll let you start it off then and figure out how to go for it.
Thanks.
Yeah, anytime.
Just dropping the ball on that one. So, okay, there's one guy that I grew up watching his stuff.
Okay.
I don't want to say I grew up watching because he's only a few years older than me, but he was what I would consider a radical Christian, but not a Westboro Baptist Church radical Christian.
Okay,
Like
there's a big difference.
there is a big difference. Like, he's doing things for the good of people, not the good of his ego.
Yeah.
And he has a church, and I'm not going to say where because I feel like if I say the city, and it's in a different country.
Yeah.
But I feel like the people that
It'd be
run
easy
in that
to figure
realm,
out, yeah.
yeah, because I don't know how many pastors there are in that particular area, but he will run his normal church services. But then, if he feels like God has called him to fly to a different country and help fight for human rights there, say there's, I think at one point there was this group of people who were Christian, who were being executed, who were being held against their will. And I want to say it was somewhere within like the Republic of China. This guy actually went there to help protest and fight for these people's rights and was arrested. And I mean, he received a pretty hefty sentence and was eventually let go. But to me, that's something Jesus would do.
I'm assuming he did not take his private jet.
He did not take his private jet.
Just making sure.
No. And he also doesn't make it like public. Like he doesn't have a whole film team that's following him there. He doesn't have like this long line of lawyers waiting to like find something wrong in the arrest paperwork or anything like that. He just goes and I've listened to him speak in person before, and he very much has that kind of John the Baptist mentality of, if I go to a country and they execute me for this, I've done my job.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really tough because I think you can have two people that go out and do the exact same thing. And one of them does it in an awesome, God-honoring way, and one of them seems to not do it that way, right? And figuring out the difference in those is really tricky sometimes. And so I think we have to be real careful in two ways. One is to not judge other people very much on that because, really only God can judge people's hearts. But at the same time, to look at those and say, how do we make sure that when we're doing our best to kind of live this radical Christian life, that we're not doing it the wrong way? And I think Matthew 6 is one of the places that you go to that talks about that all the time, right? And it just says things like, when you're doing your acts of righteousness, make sure to do them before God and not before people, right? And I think there are plenty of examples of these Christians who they see an injustice somewhere, and they instantly know that that's an opportunity for them to make a bigger name, for them to make a splash, for them to be seen, that they can go over there and help those people, and everybody's going to look at them and say, great job. And, Scripture says, hey, the people that do that, the ones that are doing what they do for the show, that they've received all the reward they're going to. Like, God isn't real excited or happy about that. And you kind of keep going there in Matthew 6, in the first part it talks about authentic righteousness, but then the second part, when it's talking about giving to the needy, it's talking about authentically doing it, not giving so that you get something. It even goes so far as to say, like, your right hand shouldn't know what your left hand is doing, which is obviously a hyperbole. But if you're going through life saying, hey, I don't want this part of me to know what that part of me is doing, well, then this part of you probably includes your PR team, right? And so if you're doing things so that people look at you why? I just think you've failed before you started. Whereas if you do the exact same thing, but you do it so that the people that you're serving won't see you, but they'll see God,
Hmm.
and then I think you've done something awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's somebody else that I grew up listening to, following, who, unfortunately, I think they started in a very authentic place.
Hmm.
But now, anytime there's a national tragedy involving a gun, he and his team are the first ones there.
Yeah.
And they're the loudest ones there. They're they're not directing anything back towards like, here's what the Bible says,
Mm-hmm.
or let's be there for the families or something like that. Let's
Sure.
show up and make food. It's always spun into this like weird political space that
Hmm.
they involve themselves in. And I feel like I said, they started very authentically, but now it's just become a, hey, look at me and all the big things I'm doing for
Yeah.
this one particular cause within the social justice realm. So, do you think, like, if you're looking at somebody to try and, like, use as inspiration or emulate what they're doing, at what point can you look at somebody and say, oh, they started good, but
Hmm.
I think we're going in a direction where it's not about the message anymore.
Yeah.
It's about them. How do you can you can you look at something that they're saying theologically and have an idea, or is it just kind of a feeling?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example to bring in because there's there's nobody that's going to argue that it's a good thing that people keep getting killed, right? So
Right.
you look at the guy that's going in and he's kind of protesting this or doing whatever he's doing, and kind of no matter which side of the aisle you're on all this, it's not a good thing when people keep getting killed. And so the guy's out there and he's in the right spot doing the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes it still feels wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are probably a lot of different litmus tests you could go through to figure out, is this right or is this not? But sometimes it's tough in the moment to go through all those and figure out, well, can we really kind of dive deep into all this? And so I think there's really only just like one that I usually take. Now, you might have a different idea. I think I'd put up a pretty big argument that this is the one that we should stick on. But you've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, where he goes through and he's talking about theological ideas, and he's talking about a lot of spiritual gifts, right? And so he's talking about you can prophesy, you can sing like angels, you can do all of these things. So presumably somewhere in the mix of like things you can do is protesting against gun violence in a correct way, right? He says you can do all of that, but if you don't have love, you're nothing. And he says they're like a banging gong or a clanging cymbal. They're just those people over there just making loud, annoying noises.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I feel like we've got a lot of Christians who are on that. They jump on their particular soapboxes, right? They get really excited about their one thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, I think God's given us all kind of different ideas that we said, this is what's really important to me. But are we doing it with love? Are
Mm-hmm.
we caring more about the people than the issue?
Mm-hmm.
And I think as soon as you move to the spot where you care more about the issue than you care about the people that it's affecting, then you've completely gone against what 1 Corinthians 13 is saying, and you no longer have love for people. And well, then you're just kind of loud and annoying.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that'd be my idea there.
And that, I mean, you saying that, we've had this conversation, like you said,
A couple of times,
multiple
yeah.
times, but you saying that, I mean, I've met both of these people I'm talking about. I've actually sat in circles and like had conversation with
Yeah.
them. And the first person who's, flying and getting arrested and all this stuff, like when you speak to him, you feel like like you get the feeling that this guy truly loves people.
Hmm.
Like that's his whole thing.
Yeah.
But the second guy, you talk and like you said, it's all about
Hmm.
the mission rather than the people that are being affected by this.
Yeah.
And so it's weird, but even you saying that now, I'm like, I can definitely see the difference in these two individuals. So how then do you know? Because I'm sure if you ask each person, both of them are going to give the same answer that they believe they're doing what they're being called to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this is a big problem, at least in my opinion, in the church, is that people will feel something and they automatically think that, yep, God's telling me to do that.
Yeah.
So like, how because I don't believe you can trust convictions. And I don't believe you can trust your feelings
Hmm.
to be like a direct message from God.
Yeah.
So then how, if you feel like you're going to do something, like say there's a shooting next week. I hope not. But say there's something and I get in my head after it happens, I feel like I'm being called to go there and film a documentary about this and
Mhm.
expose this. Well, if I was looking at that and I stepped outside of myself for a second, I would probably say, yeah, you're doing that for you.
Hmm.
So how do you look at the things that you want to do and actually differentiate this is my calling versus this is just my ego telling me that I should do something?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I kind of want to give a cop-out answer, but I also don't know that it is a cop-out answer. So let's say, there's a tragedy next week and you really do. You want to fly out there and, make your documentary. How do you figure out if you're on the right? Part of me would want to ask you, like, what's your neighbor's name and what's the thing they're struggling with the most? Like, those two things are completely unrelated, right? But I think if we can't follow Jesus' command to love our neighbor, seriously, like if you can't name all of the neighbors that are living around you, you're not really loving the people that are next to you. Well, what makes you think that you're going to do a better job of flying, a few states away or a few countries away and loving people there? And so honestly, I think sometimes the most radical things we can do also come across as some of the most mundane,
Mm.
right? Like the radical thing to do is to just live the boring life where you care about the people around you and you invest in the people that are closest to you and like you love your neighbors.
Mm.
That's not like the big showy thing. Honestly, I think we live in a time right now where it's actually not all that radical to go do the big showy type thing that you get a lot of press for. We can talk about famous pastors and all that, but like all of us do that in our own lives as well, You're not going to take a picture of what you had for breakfast this morning. But if you go on vacation a few countries away, well, then you most certainly are. You want people to see you're doing the big thing.
Mhm.
And maybe the radical part of Christianity is saying, gosh, I'm faithful and consistent in loving the people next to me every single day.
And that's interesting too, because I saw, it was a documentary a really long time ago talking about this kind of similar thing. This has always been an interest of mine, is these people that do these things.
Yeah.
And so they ask, I wish I could remember who the guy was, some pastor somewhere in a different country, maybe Germany. I feel like Germans are very truthful.
They definitely don't kind of try to make things prettier, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And they asked this guy, like, if you had the chance to sit down with any of these five, like, Christian celebrities
Hmm.
and have a discussion with them. And they gave him a list of people, one of them being, like, Mother Teresa. One was an old Graham guy,
Okay.
maybe.
There's a guy named Billy.
There we go.
He was a big name.
That guy. and so a few other people. And the guy sat back and he thought for a second and he was like, honestly, none of them. He was like, it's very easy to do this job when you're being when you're being funded millions of dollars every year to go do these things. He said, I would much rather sit down with and he gave like an age, with the 75-year-old lady who's been serving at her soup kitchen for the last 30 years, who's been baking bread for all of her neighbors when they're sick, who have been taking care of the neighborhood children. And like I thought that was interesting because that seems to be
Mm.
a true radical Christian,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. But would you say that it's easier to be one of the big name people when you have all these big organizations throwing money at you to go do these things? And is it harder to be the person who is just never mentioned, never talked about,
Mm.
but is constantly living that mission and that message out?
Yeah, boy, I think that has a whole lot to do with how you define easier and harder,
Yeah.
right? I think it's probably easier to go all these places and serve and help and all that sort of stuff when you're really well funded and there's a whole bunch of people cheering you on. But I also think that it's a lot more difficult to go and authentically be serving for Jesus when you're in that position. And
Right.
I've certainly rubbed shoulders with quite a few people who would be exactly who we're talking about. The really well funded, got millions of dollars and written tens, hundreds of books that they're always being asked to go places and do big things. And at least the ones I've had an opportunity to rub shoulders with, some of the most astoundingly humble people, and they really do see this funding and these extra people around them as a huge temptation, right? Of
Interesting.
I got to make sure that the reason I'm doing this is just I love my God and I love people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it cuts both ways. Sure, there might be some ways that it's easier to kind of be that big celebrity that's going there and doing all this stuff. But boy, I also think it's harder. Like, Jesus says it's easier for a rich person to, or for a camel to slide through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to make it to heaven. And like I think in the Christian world, we've tried to like come up with a metaphor for the eye of a needle. There really isn't one, It's just no. You've got a tiny little needle, and you're like Jesus is making a camel joke. He's got a few of them, He's saying it's impossible, and I think that's something that weighs heavy on the hearts of a lot of these people who are kind of the celebrity Christians, who, at least from what I know of them, are still trying their hardest to do it the right way.
Interesting. Interesting. So in the terms of like a radical Christian, we're talking about someone who's kind of going against societal norms to be a good person, not like a Westboro Baptist-y person who's protesting, things they shouldn't be. So how do you become a radical Christian without being a radical human?
Yeah. I would disagree with your question. I don't think you can be a radical Christian without being a radical human, but I think I know what you mean of like,
Right.
how do you become a radical Christian without going kind of crazy and doing all this sort of stuff,
Yeah.
And I really think that it's all about where you're looking to be radical. Are you looking to be radical where Jesus has put you? And if you can figure out a way to be radical in your neighborhood, I think you've got it figured out. If you've got a great reputation with all of your neighbors, with all the people that live around you, and they just look at you and say, man, that's the person that's always helping. If you have a problem, call them. They're the one that's gonna help fix it. If the people around you see you as an awesome, loving person, I think you're well on the way. But if you're trying to be radical in terms of an issue, right? Like I'm going to be the one that's known for my stance on, And pick anything, whether it's a cultural issue, a theological issue. Well, I think you're waiting dangerously close. We'll
Mm-hmm.
put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Waiting dangerously close to just wanting to promote yourself rather than wanting to promote God. And I think that's when you then become kind of the weird, radical, crazy person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, I saw this quote the other day, or statement, I guess, and it was kind of along the lines of this, and maybe this is what sparked this conversation. But it was saying the most radical thing that a Christian can do in today's times, and you would think this would go off on some like tangent that's like, probably shouldn't emulate that one. But it was saying the most radical thing a Christian can do in today's time is love every person and every group of people the same.
Hmm.
And I thought that was interesting because you see so many Christians who are, you know, they're tithing big amounts. They're setting up
Yeah.
different groups to help different people. They're doing all these things, but the things are primarily for, and I may step on some toes with this one. The things are primarily for your maybe middle class white American Christians.
Hmm.
You know, but I've definitely seen others who, no matter if it's a same sex couple, a transgender couple, a biracial couple, a couple that are 2 weeks into living in this country, that are doing the exact same things for them that they would do for the people in their church.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to me is the definition of a radical Christian,
Yeah.
because that doesn't seem to be the norm for most Christians in this country.
Yeah.
So would you say that maybe something like that is the easiest way for somebody to make themselves a radical Christian
Hmm.
and be on the right track?
You know, it's interesting because one of the lots of people look at kind of ancient Near Eastern law codes, right? Because if you're going to go through a lot of the ancient Near Eastern law codes, so many of them are really similar. So what really sets the Bible apart from any of the others, right? And there are a few things, but actually one of the things that sets the Bible, kind of the Old Testament law code, apart from pretty much any of their other ancient Near Eastern neighbors, is that the foreigner and the stranger was included in the feasts, right? That they were a part of the group, that no matter who you were, if you came in and you looked a little bit different than this group, God looked at his people and said, here's what you have to do. Anybody, regardless of what they look like, regardless of if you think they fit in your group or you think they don't, when you're having a feast, when you're having a celebration, when you're worshiping me, then you got to make sure that they are just as much a part of your family as anybody else.
Hmm.
And so what you're talking about is like one of the foundational elements of the Old Testament is just saying it doesn't matter what it looks like. And especially you get into kind of us living in a New Testament area, you know, Paul talks in Colossians a lot about the mystery of the gospel. And every time he talks about the mystery of the gospel, he says the mystery is that us, like non-Jewish people, that we're included in it.
Mm.
But like that's the revolutionary, that's the radical part of Christianity, is that we all get a chance to be a part of God's family. He's adopted us into it. Well, if that's the radical part of Christianity, let's keep doing that. Let's keep saying,
Mhm.
yeah, I really wasn't supposed to be included in this family because many of the reasons you want to. There's a lot of them. And so you look out and you see other people that, well, they don't look like you for whatever reason. Hey, even if they don't look like me, they're just as much a part of God's family as I am, because, well, I don't really look like somebody that should be in God's family either.
Mm. So this may be venturing off topic a little, but where did where or when did Christianity start straying from that thought process? Because I mean, I feel like if you look at the majority of places now, churches,
Mm-hmm.
that's not the overwhelming. I mean, I've walked into churches before that are
Yeah.
like, you have tattoos. you're dressed weird. Like
Uh-huh.
you don't act like, and they're definitely very judgmental of that. But I've also seen churches before where a same-sex couple walks in and they escort that couple out of the church.
Hmm.
So where did we go wrong?
Yeah, I think the question of where did we go wrong kind of shows a little bit about where we live too, right? Because I
Right.
think there's lots of places in the world like right now. I'd say lots of churches in America, and hopefully ours is one of them too, that doesn't fit into that category at all.
Right.
So honestly, I think from the get-go, you kind of read through the book of Acts, right? And so you're within the apostles are still leading the show, and there's already kind of the tensions a little bit between the Jewish Christians and the Greek Christians, right? And who's going to be able to make these decisions? And there's a whole deal about who's going to be feeding which widows and how does that work? So I think there's been a tension there from the beginning, and I think the more that you're living like Christ, the less that those walls get put up, and the more that you're living for yourself, the more the walls do get put up.
Mm.
But I don't think you can say that the church as a whole is going that way or isn't going that way. I think there's pockets everywhere and always has been where people are doing it the right way. And there's also always been people that are trying to use scripture and use religion and use Jesus as a weapon to exclude certain groups.
So if somebody was watching and that person had this idea of something that they could be doing, but they're unsure, is this something God actually wants me to do, or is this my own ego talking because I want to talk about myself,
Hmm.
or I'm doing this subconsciously, it's actually for me. What would you say to them to help them figure out if they're being truly guided to do this thing by God, or it's actually just their human form shining
Yeah.
through?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really tough question to answer, but I think one of the easy places to start is just how's your walk with Jesus right now? Like if you read through the Gospels, Jesus gives us over 100 different commands. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. Are we following those? Because if you're not following the things that Jesus has already told you to do in Scripture, I don't believe he's going to give you something extra at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you can't say that you're following these, well, he's not giving you anything else. And I think the other way to just look at it is to say, is this born out of the great commandment? Well, doing this, love God and love people. And I think there's a lot of times, and I'm sure I've fallen into this boat before, where we look at it and we have this like holier than thou attitude, and we're like, well, this is the most loving thing I could do for those people is tell them they're wrong. I don't know that you can really say you love someone if they don't ever feel or experience that love.
Right.
And so maybe looking at love not just from kind of this weird religious perspective, but
Mm-hmm.
from an honest perspective of, does the person think what you're doing is loving? And so I think that would be the place that I would start. But I think that's a really tough question to answer, and probably one that has to be taken on an individual basis every time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think, and here's my last question for you, and I'll let you finish up with anything you have. Do you think it differs if somebody's looking at it and saying, okay, I want to do this thing and it's for other people. Nobody's gonna know it was me. Like maybe it's donating anonymously to a food pantry or going and helping at a soup kitchen like one of the ones we have in downtown Denver.
Sure.
Is that different? Like, are you held to a different standard than if you say, actually, the thing I want to do is teaching this concept to people? Because I feel like preaching a concept to people and then just kind of anonymously helping I feel like that should be two different things. Like, is there two different set of standards for that? Like, do you have different standards as a pastor for what would be a calling than what somebody would have just as like a I don't know how to say this, a normal peasant Christian.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's well, I wish I was a little bit more prepared because for some reason the verse isn't coming, but I think it's in James where it says, "Not many of you should seek to be teachers because they're going to be judged more harshly." So there's a big difference between going out and trying to serve and trying to do things and trying to do that and telling other people to follow you, right? And I think as soon as you make the jump from this is something I'm doing to this is something that I'm doing and I'm telling everybody else they should do, then God looks at you and says, "Hey, watch out. Just make sure that when you're telling other people what to do, that it's actually coming from God, because I think He's going to be far more upset if you're standing in front of people and saying, thus saith the Lord, and really it's just whatever we're thinking." So yeah, I think there's a big difference. I think the worst group is the ones that stands up though and tells people what to do and never does it themselves. And so no matter where you are on that spectrum, I think the first thing they have to do is say, "Hey, it's time for me to live like a radical Christian. It's time for me to do what Jesus told me to do. It's time for me to go look at my neighbors and say, I got to figure out the best way to love these people."
Interesting. I feel like this conversation could go on forever,
I think so.
but do you have anything?
I don't know that I do. I think this is a conversation that has the potential to go wrong in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And so I just want to urge a little bit of caution here too, because a lot of what we've talked about, we've kind of couched it in looking at other people, and we've just used them as examples. But I think the most important thing to hear is not that here's a litmus test for how we decide if other people are doing things well, but rather here's the litmus test for how we can figure out if we are living the right way. And so to take these words and apply them to ourselves long before we decide to apply them to anybody else. I think that would be the main thing that I'd want to kind of end on and make sure that we emphasized.